Welcome to 2 Month Review, the weekly podcast in which we read a single book bit by bit, piece by piece, enjoying it, talking about it, discussing it, debating it. Right now, as you probably know, we've been reading Tómas Jónsson Bestseller by Gudbjörg Bergson, which is translated by my co-host, Lytton Smith. And this week, we're joined by Idra Novey, who, of course, I had your bio up online, and then you absolutely don't have it up now because I had to restart my computer. So, Idra, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm going to try and do an improv bio here. Most recently, you wrote the novel Ways to Disappear, which was like a huge success that came out last year, correct?
Well, it did come out last year. Thank you.
And it was a huge success. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
It was a gigantic success. But you're also that was a novel, but you've also written collections of poetry and you translate from Portuguese and have done at least the Lispector book that, did you do The Passion According to G.H.?
I did. And I've also translated a novel from Spanish.
Oh, which novel from Spanish did you do?
I did the novel On Elegance While Sleeping by Visconde Lascano-Tegui for Dalkey Archive. It came out in 2010.
Right. I remember that too, but I didn't realize that was Spanish. For some reason, I was thinking that was from Brazil as well.
Yeah. Well, he was born in Uruguay, but he's considered an Argentine writer. So he writes in Spanish. Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. And you are right now on an island, I believe?
No, not quite on the island yet. I'm actually in Pittsburgh right now at City of Asylum, which kind of is perfect because they have just created, I'm happy to give them a plug on the podcast, an international literature bookstore here in Pittsburgh. It's the first internationally focused bookstore in the city, an independent bookstore associated with City of Asylum, and they give residencies to exiled writers who've received death threats, and they give them a house here in Samsonia Way. So I'm just hanging out here for a couple days with the City of Asylum people.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell them I say hi, and that I'm sorry I didn't get to visit them when I was in Pittsburgh for baseball games. But I'm well aware of their store, and they do great stuff.
They do amazing things. Yes, it's fantastic. So anyway, so that's where I am. Yes, back in the Berg. But it's amazing because it's a street, and there's a house poem where if you come to their offices, there's a house that's covered with a poem, and there's quotes from various poets all over the walls.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's very cool. Pittsburgh is really cool. Pittsburgh is really nice.
It is.
Yeah. I don't think everyone knows that, but it actually is very, very nice. And you two, you agreed to come on here to talk about Tómas Jónsson because you and Lytton went to school together, correct?
Yes. Lytton and I created, I think, was it Lytton? It was the second incarnation of the Graduate Student Translation Conference together many years ago.
Absolutely.
At Columbia. Yeah. So we've done a translation conference together. We've co-taught a bunch of classes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, back in our Columbia days, and we were in Michael Skemble's translation workshop together and a couple of poetry workshops. So we go ways back, and it's always fun to get to talk together and talk about various translation things.
And Lytton and I taught a translation workshop, co-taught it in the summer program at Columbia. And Lytton, I forgot to tell you that a student recently came up to me who was pursuing a master's in translation, which she said she caught the bug in our workshop back in 2001.
Fantastic.
That was exciting.
There we go.
That was nice to hear.
Yeah. We actually, since we record these so far in advance, especially since because of vacation and summer and whatever, you haven't been able to hear this yet. But Idra, the guest last week was Jacob Rogers, who I met at the Bread Loaf at Translation Loaf, who was in your workshop there, and he was singing your praises last week.
Oh, he's wonderful. Oh, that's such a nice surprise. Yeah, he was fantastic. Great translator. I think that I expect to see that book in the world soon.
I don't remember which one he did for you. He did tell us this, but I have a sample of one of his books, but I don't think it was the one that you guys workshopped.
Ah, all right. He's very talented. So he might have switched projects. Hard to know.
I think he had a couple things going on, and this one he thought seemed appropriate for us. But I might be. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yes.
It's good for you to be on here to talk about this crazy book. And this week, for people following along, we are going over 2 sections. Tómas's 7th composition book, and I think the next one is just called 8. Yeah, 8. Mm-hmm. And they cover pages 140 through 199. So essentially like a 50-page section. And like usually, try and like sort of summarize these. It's not necessarily the easiest thing, but in this case, rather than try and go through like all the plot points of this, I just want to say that after I finished reading these 2 sections last night, the thing that stood out to me the most about them was that this is one big chunk where a lot of it has to deal with like Tómas's family. So there's a bit about how he references being alone and how his family is dead, how his sister has died. I don't even remember if he goes to the funeral or not. Then he kind of starts telling about like not just his family, but about his history of how he got his apartment, how he is like, how he doesn't have any kids, how he doesn't seem to like kids. Kids play a huge role in this section where he's talking about his lodgers and like how they just basically procreate wildly, and there's lots of kids playing ball outside in the hallway, pisses him off. And then there's like a whole weird section that kind of goes back in time in which he's sort of hitting on Disa, and she sort of rejects him, and it goes into then a little bit about one of his friend or acquaintance, different guy that he knows from the dining hall, who is going out and picking up women after bars close late at night. And he sort of follows along and sort of watches that in a very sort of creepy and odd sort of way. But this section, one thing, just looking through it, even the parts I underline, it keeps coming up again and again and again about like the family, the lack of family, how families aren't important. Like even on the very first part of this, the very first page, I believe, of our section, it says, most people think that happiness in life comes from your image as others see it. No, it resides in your image of yourself. In their homespun faith, people look for happiness among neighbors and family members. I curse my family, even though it is dead and distant. So to try and like, I don't think that there's any good way to like go through the plot of these parts. But to sort of get things started thematically, I think that family and his relationship to like the idea of building a family, of having a spouse and having children and creating like sort of a family that way seems to be like a huge part that gets played off of in these 2 sections. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it seems like there's a bit of an irony to that I think when you don't have something that's just a human impulse to convince yourself that you're glad you don't have it, you know, and that like the intensity of his vitriol, I think, is a testament to some sort of unspoken longing in the book to a certain extent, because if he didn't think family had any meaning, why does he spend so much time talking about it? You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it's a paradox there. So
I think it's a paradox that's at the heart of the book for me as a translator of it, because you know there are the moments when this book explicitly draws a parallel between Tómas and the modern Icelandic nation, right? And so that there is a sense that every time, if you're following along with us, if you're reading along, when you think about him cast himself as isolated, you can just almost substitute Iceland for his name. And
yes,
that's the criticism that, if Iceland believes it can be this amazing, independent, isolated nation, there's a limitation to that. And I'm not going to draw any links to any current anti-globalist tendencies, but I'll leave that hanging.
Well, but he does talk several times about the supremacists in Norway, how much he hates the supremacists in Norway, which is interesting. You know, he like says, that there's like this supremacy movement in Norway or something like that. But then he also is an isolationist. It just there seems to be like a lot of like ambivalence that's then he sort of talks over his own ambivalence by denying it, which just makes it worse.
Yeah, that's kind of like basically like, I mean, that's kind of a way to approach the entire book, is that sort of ambivalence in the way that he is sort of contradicting himself, going in both directions at once, and is kind of what makes him fascinating. And this section too, the other thing that I want to throw out is that this is one of the more challenging sections so far because it's one of the times in which there are like a billion interruptions. And like the time, a lot of the other sections, like the one we did last week with Jacob, there's like some weird stuff at the beginning. But then when it got to the section about the board and describing the board, all of that was sort of explained. That part was very straightforward and seemed to be all of a particular time, or at least a range of times where you knew it was kind of happening. And you could kind of place it. In this case, it goes all over. And there's like the sections where like the kids are playing in the hall where he's writing a line and then it's interrupted by the sound of people in the hall. There's also these interruptions of like several times in here where it says the manuscript is damaged or something must have happened here because it doesn't seem to make sense, I think is even one of the lines, which I think in like our mini pre-conversation was something that struck you, Idra, in terms of like the difficulty of having to translate so many different registers and tones in this particular part.
Yes, because I think we have a tendency that whenever there's a change in register or something feels hard to understand, that we will assume it was the translator's thing to sort of to recreate, so that whenever there's a dissonance in the register, we think that the translator hasn't delivered something, when actually that dissonance is in the original, and the disconnect, the translator's then recreating the disconnect. So I wondered for you, Lytton, thinking about how to portray all of that by doing all these different registers and getting them so that there's a flow, but then also conveying the disconnect that he was doing as a writer with the original.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's one we struggle with, and it's one of those things where, you know, part of you is having to set aside the ego a bit because you want people to sort of pat you on the head and say you got it right, but getting it right might mean translating it in a way that it might look wrong because it seems dissonant. And if that's what the original book is doing, then you have to follow it. And I think the sort of the advantage here, or the sort of thing I was trying for here, was just drawing on all of the many hats I've had the luxury to wear, you know. So my time, you know, doing a PhD and sort of, you know, being in the academic world was something that I was definitely tapping into when we've got that strange moment of the essay in Icelandic studies, right? You know, and the fact that I love black comedy, you know, if I'm going to watch anything, I would be sort of League of Gentlemen or something like that, and so sort of, you know, tapping into those pleasures as a way to sort of deal with some of the moments which are just, you know, they're sinister, and I think they're presented to us in a way that we sort of have to suddenly pull up and say, hold on, are we okay with this? Are we okay with keeping reading? And you have to sort of find the cultural touch points. I mean, Black Mirror was another thing. I don't know if people have seen that TV series, but if you haven't, I feel like that's a companion piece to this book for me, at least in terms of.
Yes, I did see Black Mirror, and it is relentlessly bleak in a similar way. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But I thought, you know, the thing about Black Mirror that keeps you watching is one where it's just like kind of sucks you in, but also that some of the images are so striking. And I think that happens in this book too. You know, like the end of the second section that we're talking about, when he ends with that image, the salmon run of my heart.
Oh, yeah.
You know, of the blue veins that swim up and down the salmon run of my heart. It's just a really gorgeous image. You know, and Lytton, you create the music of it, you know, with the M's of salmon and swim and like it's all there. So I think sometimes that can, even though it is so bleak, that the language itself is so beautiful in the translation that you're too hypnotized, I think, to stop.
Yeah, I think that's very true too. I think it's bleak. The Black Mirror is different to me in a weird way, because I think Black Mirror is like so philosophically fucks with your brain and your soul, whereas this is like, at least it's one guy where you could pretend that you're not in the same situation as that, whereas Black Mirror just encompasses the world in some way and like makes you feel like nothing, there is no hope. At least I'm not Tómas Jónsson.
But are you?
Yes. But some of the lines are, you know, like there's just, sometimes I think, you know, almost if you're reading John Ashby or like a lot of poetry where like your mind snags on a certain line that kind of wins you over to such a degree that you're kind of put up with anything. Another line I really loved was on 198 where he says, the human heart has long been a difficult assignment.
Yeah, that one is really spectacular.
It's wry, you know, it's like this wry thing, you know, that like existence is merely nothing but like an assignment that you can either complete or fail to complete, which in some way I think goes back to the notion of procreating,
Yeah.
If like your biological assignment is to procreate, recreate yourself, and you don't, then what is your assignment as a person? Which is something he's wrestling with. And what is like Iceland's assignment then? It's to recreate its Iceland or to be a different Iceland?
That was what I was going to say too, that procreation seems to play a large role in an island nation that's trying to establish itself and stay alive.
Yeah.
And it's going to set up some things for next week's podcast as well, because the question of procreation really takes a dark turn in the next section. So we won't say too much about that now, but for people who are following on and haven't yet read ahead, this will come back up next week.
Hey, Lytton, I had a very specific translation question, or maybe it's a cultural question for you, or just a I'm an ignorant person question. But on page, where did my notes go? How did I just lose that? There's a phrase that's repeated like 3 times in here that sort of played with. Oh God, now I'm gonna have to find it. This is a disaster. Where did I put that piece of paper? It was right here.
This is the thing that this book does to you, though, right? It's, you say, every time you feel like you've got some kind of stability, you really are sort of left to kind of adrift. And that's why there's so much of these metaphors of moving water and the sea and the ocean. And Iceland never seems intact.
You can keep killing time for me, but this paper is gone.
I wonder whether we should talk a little bit about, what is the sort of the most challenging moment in this section, which is on page 164, which is this sort of like newspaper snippet of immoral conduct with young girl.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's another moment where, so it's another tonal register. So as a translator, I'm having to sort of think, how can I get this to sound a little bit like a newspaper, or the way that Tómas Jónsson might imagine a 1960s newspaper sounding. But then you've also got to think as a translator about dealing with the content. And I'm sort of curious how this struck you as a reader, Idra.
I was very disturbed by that. And also the girl who gets frozen to the surface and has to be like yanked off with a crowbar and loses her colon. I mean, there's like a couple things where you're like, I was thinking about how this incident, of this, I mean, it's funny in a very dark way, that whatever is done by this man, she not only has a nervous breakdown, she starts speaking in a foreign language, how like the trauma leads to some sort of linguistic breakdown, which in some ways is what the novel is also. But it is interesting how he throws around these sort of acts of violence against girls that he then never picks them up again, and so they're just kind of dropped in there, which I always worry about, using that as like a quick way to sort of just add more chaos, random acts of violence for chaos' sake.
I mean, he's this interesting figure in the sense that, we've talked about him in past podcasts, as that's a tongue twister there, as somebody who's sort of like a complete anti-hero, but also at the same time not a villain. And yet there's a couple of things which he may or may not have done which are entirely villainous, right? And this, if this is what he's been up to, then it is entirely villainous. And yet there's something very interesting in which there's this, it's a very phallocentric, prick-heavy chapter in particular. I mean, it ends with, and this is the thing the Icelandic writer Sjón loves about this book in some ways, is this passport to his penis here, right? Mm-hmm. And yet for all of this braggadocio, he's actually this entirely impotent, incompetent character. He needs women to tend him. He's left to listen to them. He's left to listen. But
I think
go on.
And the question is, how to hear that as a reader when it is a man's impotence that's driving him to do graphic, disturbing descriptions of violence done to girls. Exactly. How does that tactic as a writer land? In 1967, is that when the book came out? Yep. And then how does it land now? I loved reading Julio Cortázar in college, was just like so enamored of it. And I still love going back, and I think that, you know, the surprise of his surrealism is just like without par. I just absolutely love reading it. But I just remember going back and reading Hopscotch and having a line in it where one of the characters says that the main female in the book, had to go back and rest because she couldn't take any more of their brilliance.
Right.
You know,
right.
And I was just like, all the books in the world, am I giving time to this one? You know, It's just like, it wears on you when you can just suspend and see it, you know, in another era and, you know, just give it its due for the context in which it was written, which I think is playing out now all over the place. You know, you look what's happening in Charlottesville and you know, are these symbols, these statues, and is taking them down essential for progress? And how many people emphatically think that is the case. And then obviously we saw people who don't think that's the case. And I think that's playing out subtly a lot with books from earlier eras. You know, what kind of remove do you read that kind of incident in a book? In what way? We understand why he's doing it, and you can just read it as sort of part of his literary conceit of conveying the narrator's misogynism or his frustration with his own impotence, which then manifests itself as this.
Yep.
But it's from another era, right? This book, when was it first published? 1967?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think some of this mirrors, you know, some of the controversies that Guðbergur Bergsson has himself gotten into over the years, you know, not in the same way as Tómas Jónsson, but, you know, in terms of things he sort of said about, you know, Günter Grass and other acclaimed European writers that have, you know, not been met with a lot of pleasure by the literary establishment. And he can be a very contentious figure in that way. And that makes him a bit like Tómas Jónsson. It's interesting you mentioned Charlottesville. It's obviously on our minds. This podcast is going out a long way after that, but we're recording it, you know, right up at the time. And the sort of the very retrograde view that the neo-Nazi men involved in that have of the role of women in society is something that, you know, I think the book is aware of here. And I think the book is saying that that's a risk that Icelandic nationalism is running, right? So I think what's kept it current, because it went through 3 editions, the last edition was in the 21st century,
is the warning he puts out there against it.
Right, and I think we constantly, you know, like Iceland is constantly in these, like, the happiest nations in the world, and, you know, they've had, you know, women running the country, and gay women running the country, and, you know, you can be a single mother, and there's no judgment, and all of this, and we tend to sort of say, oh, you know, it's this paradise for women. And actually, when you start to get under the surface, there are these problems here that I think Guðbergur Bergsson is aware of. Now, whether he goes far enough in terms of whether he's simply pointing them out and then letting them continue to exist, or whether he's able to subvert them in another way, I think that's something that it's really important that readers decide. But I think it's certainly exposing something for us about not only our own mentalities, but also sort of how Icelandic society works too.
Well, you know, when Junot Díaz, you know, with Oscar Wilde, there was a lot of, I think, pushback saying, you know, that the character is really misogynist, that there's misogyny in the book. And he was saying, well, that's the character's misogynism. And by recreating misogyny within the book, it's a way to understand this misogynist character and the root of the misogynism the character had. And where do you know, how much is separating the creation or the construct of a character who is misogynist and then the author trafficking in misogynism? You know, they're two very different things. And, you know, it's easy to make a case to say, well, you create a character like this in order to understand why these, you know, this hatred persists in somebody like this. So I think there's, you know, a long literary tradition of doing that. And I think that's what he's doing here. But I do think, I'm glad you brought it up, because I think those incidents in the book, they kind of break the spell, you know, of the prose before and after it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to add anything to that unless you guys have more to add to that. But I did find the sentences that I have a question about, which is a totally different subject, though. So I don't know if anyone has anything left to add on there, because there's that section, but then that's almost contrasted with him chasing after the what's the guy's name? Bjössi, who like goes and finds mates by like waiting for in another great image, waiting for like the nightclubs to vomit forth people, and seeing like the women who do not have partners at that time, and then just being like, "Hey, I've got a car, come with me." Like, and Tómas Jónsson sort of like following in that, maybe like half like spying on him because he wants that to be rid from the world because he thinks that's disgusting and bad, and wants to make sure that guy doesn't like get away with it, but at the same time seems to be sort of like following along in that footsteps. There seems to be a counterpart to that particular little passage about the girl.
Yeah,
yes.
And it's page 192 where, he sort of said, this man's name will be in the papers. All of Iceland will get to know what he's called and why he was loitering there. And this sense of shame being used to try and police behavior. But at the same time, and going back to something Idra really smartly said earlier, like the fact that he's spending time focusing on this, there's perhaps some kind of desire there and really, Tómas Jónsson does take on that role at various points. So I think every time we're meant to sort of say, yes, Tómas Jónsson is doing the right thing and calling this out, he then slips back into doing absolutely the wrong thing.
It also does give a roadmap to like his varying forms of rejection of like how his mind starts working. The funniest part to me about that is that he seems to think that writing means something, which is still, I'm going to hone in on that. The number of times that this book makes fun of writers and writing in general is spectacular. And that's one too, where he's like, no, what we need is an energetic progressive journalist to eradicate this behavior via a pithy article, or a writer to compose a poem about these blatant poachers. Here we have the basic framework for poetic social commentary. as if that
right. Yep.
would matter at all. The question I had about the statement is on page 174. It says, this exclamation, my Jerry in Cho, is still popular out in the country. And then I feel like it's played with two other times. I can only find one. That's on 185. It says, my G, how good. I just don't know what this is. And maybe it's just me, or maybe you have some insight, Lytton.
Right. I mean, it's one of these moments where he starts going in. It's one of the, I sort of talked to a lot of people back in Iceland about this and where he's going. And he sort of just seems to be, there is a play on some kind of call out to Jesus, right? So there's like page 175, my only G. But then he's deforming that. And he's a writer who's famously sort of anti-God, anti the idea of God. Like, God is always lowercased in his works, and it's sort of one of the critical points people have made. And so, he's sort of playing around with it and deforming that, but it really becomes nonsense, I think.
Yeah.
And that there are these moments, and it goes back to what Idra was sort of saying about translating in different registers and allowing for dissonance. There are moments where there are things that aren't going to make sense in Icelandic or in English. I'm sure there are moments which maybe might make sense to a different reader than me, and that's one of the other things about translating is that you come back to things and maybe in 20 years' time I'll know the world better and understand something I don't today. But there are also moments which sort of exceed what we think of as sense, and I think it's kind of sort of fine for that to be there.
Yeah.
Well, this same page you brought up, Chad, 185, has one of those paragraphs where he says, is it pronounced Disa, or is that how you say her name?
Oh, yeah.
Disa's whole character is feminine. She is 100% woman. If she understands anything, she understands the meaning of the feminine, the value of feminine intuition, of looking at things from a woman's point of view, and even of conflicts within the feminine perspective.
Right.
And, that feels very dated in a way, and it's unclear of whether he's saying that in an ironic way or he really thinks that there's some sort of that this is the woman that he keeps returning to because she is 100% feminine, whenever that he's assuming that to mean. That feels very much almost like the women in Kundera's novels. It's like kind of like this mythic all-consuming female counterpart to the raging male.
And I want to be really careful here because I don't want to be the man who's then turning around and saying, "Oh yeah, it's definitely ironic, right?" But as a translator, I think in this section, because it's further up in the page, there's this reference to like Disa's hands are white and feminine, blue, Nordic, gently feminine eyes that are reminiscent of two sky blue forget-me-nots in deep snow, which is sort of this hackneyed poetic image in many ways. And I think translating this, the word feminine kept coming up so much that it felt like, okay, this is being laid on a bit thick, and maybe translation encourages you towards an ironic meaning because you're spending so much time with the repetition and noticing it so much. But also the fact that, she's associated, in his view of her, with the Nordic, which has already been criticized for its risks of association with white supremacy. And, Hitler is going to make a cameo in this book. I can't help but feel that this is a moment where we are sort of seeing the world through Thomas's eyes and flirting with a worldview which we're meant to wholeheartedly reject. And in that sense, the thoughts and sentiments are very much meant to be ones that we sort of find ourselves rejecting Tómas Jónsson for. Risky again, but that's sort of partly the process of translating.
This book had a huge impact on Icelandic literature. And so I think reading it now and seeing what was exciting for it and also reading it now in translation is also the formal experimentation. I think there are many reasons you can be really interested in a book beyond just what values it holds in terms of gender constructs. Yep. I think what he's doing in terms of just fragmenting the novel and throwing in all these interruptions, as Chad called them, that's also just like something that's actually really forward thinking about the book. And I don't think anyone as a writer is usually forward thinking in every way.
Sure.
It's just unlikely. All of us, we all think we're all just, hurling ourselves into the future in terms of the way we think. But I'm sure in 10, 15 years time, we will also seem of a certain era,
Yeah. So. It leads me to a question for you, actually, Idra, because I and you don't have to name names here, but I mean, you've translated so many different authors, and I'm wondering whether you find yourself as a translator generally giving the authors you translate the benefit of the doubt and sort of seeing them as more perfect than perhaps they are, or whether you genuinely sort of get to know them so well that you see their flaws and love them despite that, if that makes any sense.
I think often the flaws, as with this book, are what make a writer distinctive and interesting in a way, and not like a flawless book or a flawless writer would seem obedient to a certain extent, and it doesn't sort of catch you off guard or doesn't sort of, turn something on the head that's about what you're doing. Then as a reader, then it's not as much fun to read.
Yeah. It's a great answer.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and you don't want to be continually sort of put off guard, but feeling like you're at odds with the writer as a translator all the time. But if you agree with them on everything, then you would sort of feel like that they were doing a template for what the novel's supposed to do, and then there wouldn't be any sense of them, showing their humanity because everybody's flawed.
Right.
So,
Right.
And this character is so flawed. He's kind of like almost like a caricature of a flawed man. He's like, almost like exaggeratedly flawed, or like larger than life flawed.
One of the things that's difficult, or in relation to what you're talking about too, in these specific passages, is because this is taking place at like 5 different time periods. Maybe even more. I'm trying to think about it, I could even parse those out. But it's telling stories from so many different time periods all smushed into one, that there is this way of like seeing the character as someone who thinks of himself in one way as a sort of idealized, like his idealized young form where he like counts the money correctly and he's, and he goes back to say like, oh, you gave me too much, as if that's going to earn him some sort of reward, and instead sort of backfires on that. That he has this sort of idealism himself, that he's frugal, that he saves things, that he doesn't drink, that he doesn't behave in these ways that these other people do, and that keeps getting broken, and then he ends up as this like corrupted, angry, misogynistic, alone, fucked up old dude. But like in the section, the feminine section, that's the one that's like it's taking place in like 44, whereas a lot of the other parts of this particular section are taking place in like the 60s as he's closer to his death. Maybe because all the sections with the kids are super confusing me because I don't know any of their names and I can't keep their names straight and I don't know if they're real. Like I'm not certain that there are that many kids. I think there's like one. Or whatever.
Well, I think you've also got here like the neighborhood kids in addition to the family, the lodgers kids. But I think there is a certain sense in which in his mind the kids proliferate, and he's perhaps also sort of at times you almost wonder whether some of the things he says to the kids are the things he's actually said as this geriatric, and some of the things he said to the kids are things that he said to kids when he was a kid, and you never quite know.
Right. And it creates a weird level of like where he's saying something and then almost reflecting on it. It becomes more ironic because it's within the context of him in 1967, alone and corrupted and crazy, trying to think back to like the time in 1944 when he thought that he was going to have this romantic interlude with Disa, and that's never going to work and doesn't happen, obviously. And like that, all of like the levels of like how his persona and his character gets twisted and bent and mashed up and out of shape and battered is interesting, especially because it is taking place over all these time frames almost at once.
Right.
It's a wild ride, this book.
Well, that's, I mean, I know we you know, like maybe I'm anticipating something to come, but the like one of the things I love about this section, just if I can pull out a couple of sentences that I actually really love, is the way that suddenly within a sentence we've moved through time. So on page 179, and then the door opens further on in time, and again the frost has come and autumn returned, it started to rain. On page 180, I disappear as far back in time as I came. And I could spend all day sort of like thinking about a sentence like that and thinking, hold on, which time period are we in that one sentence even? Because he's disappearing back in time, but remembering how he's come forward. And I think, yes, people are going to read this section of it is a wild ride, and it is maybe the most confusing, but it's also this experience that maybe you have at that moment in time when he knows he's approaching the end of his life and he's playing it back, but memory doesn't work in linear ways, and so he's not seeing it in linear order.
This is the one section too. We should probably wrap up here with like some of our favorite sentences if we have some left. But it also is one part where like he goes through like that because he refers to his death a bunch of times in here, and this like the line that I would point to as being like my favorite on here if I can find it is the one where if I die, no, they will discover eternal life before it comes to that. That's my favorite line in here because it goes right to that contradiction of like he knows where he's at, and yet still hanging on to like, well, maybe I'll be able to live forever because they're going to figure things out. And it does play through this whole like life trajectory in here. Like the children grow up, the girls grow up, they move on, they become these other people that he has issues with. There's the family, the lodgers come in, and then suddenly they're having all these kids. All this time is passing, all these family things are happening, and his sister's in the grave. All that time keeps flowing by, and he's like, yeah, I'm coming to my end, but maybe they'll find a way that I'll be able to live forever. So it's like all those contradictions come clear in this one, or come out a lot, and that's why I think I like this section quite a bit too, is that
also,
it is
I think
confusing.
that like in his disgust with everyone, sometimes he gets these great images, like on 173, where he talks about the people and he says, a Sunday morning when he has belched out the wind from the donuts and coffee.
Oh, yeah.
And then right above that, there's the other thing about his nails, where he says the nails swollen and bluish, licked with kerosene. Just I think sometimes the details are just so unexpected, and precise. Even if they come from a place of disgust, their precision is kind of startling.
Yeah, that's very true. So because it's like the moments where he's lucid.
Yes. Even if it is disgust-driven.
Right.
Well, and here's an example. I mean, I'll add a sentence, which is sort of, coming from the sort of focus on image in this section, and was a real pleasure translating those images. But on page 159, a lot of rain has fallen, and the sun sucks the rain from the earth in a white spray. And the fact that he can sort of corrupt the image of sort of like the sun heating up the earth and getting rid of the rain to this like moment of negative sucking, I think says a lot about his anti-world misanthropic mindset.
Yeah, but the images are just like so unexpected, and they really sort of, I think they keep you reading regardless, just because they're just really stunning images, which I think is why I was reading this. I was like, wow, Lytton, you really, really, this translation is top notch. It is excellent. It is so good.
Thank you.
Crazy. It's so good. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Idra, and have fun in Pittsburgh.
Oh, thank you.
And on the
Thanks
island.
for having me on.
Of course.
Bye-bye.
And we'll be back next week with whatever the next section is. It is pages 200 through 238. This is not even a full section. It's section 9 and part of section 10, the 10th composition book. But it's the next 38 pages. We'll be back then with David Smith, who is a former intern at Open Letter and translator from Norwegian. So talk to you then. Take care, everyone. Bye.